Good morning. You are listening to WXOX 97.1 in Louisville, Kentucky, or perhaps you are streaming on artxfm.com through our easily available free app. This is LVA's Artebella on the radio. My name is Keith Waits, and the show is produced by Louisville Visual Art. And we have a good friend of Louisville Visual Art here with us today. For 20 years, Lori Larusso's art has graced local, national, and international venues. Her consistently experimental and evolving work has earned her multiple awards from the Great Meadows Foundation, South Arts, Kentucky Arts Council, and Kentucky Foundation for Women. Additionally, Lori has been awarded numerous residency fellowships from institutions including the Bemis Center for Contemporary Art, McCall Center for Art Plus Innovation, Sam and Adele Golden Foundation, McDowell, and Chaw North. She was the recipient of the 2020 Bill Fisher Award for the Visual Arts from the Community Foundation of Louisville and Louisville Visual Art. Her first solo show in Louisville, Rogue Intensities, is currently up at Guapi Projects through the rest of May. Lori Larusso, welcome.
Hi, Keith.
So I find it hard to believe this is your first solo show because I've been seeing your work for a while, but this is your first solo show. Congratulations!
My first solo show in Louisville. Yes, yes. I've shown elsewhere in several states outside of Louisville in solo shows, but this is my first solo show here in Louisville, right. And I couldn't be happier.
Well, and at the wonderful Guapi Projects run by our friend and very frequent guest on the show, John Brooks. Wonderful artist, and I think such a beautiful gallery space. So, So tell me about. So if someone comes to see this show, which of course we encourage people to do, you can find Lori Larusso online, of course, but that should only be a teaser that would make you want to go and see the work in person. If people come to Guapi to see this show, what kind of work? What's the work doing in there? What's going
on? Well, I guess the short answer is I make paintings, but I like to say that they're not super traditional in their format. A lot of them are shapes, are cut out. Some of them have a little bit of dimensionality to them. Yeah, you can look my work up online, but the work in the show is all pretty new, and a lot of that is not online. Most of it is not. So really excited to show a body of new work, most of which I've made, all of which I think I've made within the past year and maybe 2 months, pretty much since the pandemic hit. Some of those pieces I made in Louisville working here. Some of them I made at a residency in Brookings, South Dakota, one in Columbia, South Carolina. There's a lot of food imagery, there's a lot of animal imagery, and I would really like everyone to go see the show. So I'm happy to talk more about it, but I would just encourage you to go to Guapi Projects. The show is actually up through June 12th. So you have a full almost 2 weeks into June. It's a beautiful space in New Lou. John has gallery hours, and you can also make an appointment if you can't go during the gallery hours, or if you don't feel comfortable going when there might be another couple of humans around. But in general, it's a fairly open space and isn't likely to get too crowded. So please go see the show.
Well, I've said it often on this show, but it always bears repeating that going to a gallery with a friend, let's say the person that you were quarantined with, is actually has been, I think, for quite some time, the one cultural experience that you could still have that was almost like before the pandemic. You know, if you go with somebody that you're comfortable with being with, most galleries do not have on a normal day that they're open, do not have so much of a crowd that you're putting yourself at a lot of risk there. So I've thought for a long time it was the one safe thing that people could do. So now you know, when I look deeper into your art statement, you talk about how your work is, and correct me if I'm off base here a little bit, that your work has to do with gender roles and social norms and things like that.
Yeah, that's definitely a component of the work, kind of the ingrained or assumed roles that we as a culture expect of one another. So some are chosen and some are just kind of assumed or ingrained in the culture.
But you're examining that idea though through the observation of what seems like fairly ordinary, sort of mundane objects that we encounter every day. At least that's sort of a basis of your work. And I think what I've seen in the last few years is you sort of really pushed that and gone maybe a little bit further away from that idea, but is that sort of the core of the approach about these items in our kitchen, these items in our house that would seem to not have any meaning, but they seem to have a meaning in the way you incorporate them into your work?
Yeah, that's definitely there. Definitely a big component of it. So it's objects, it's mundane objects, and I like to say, I think it's important that I note that this is all from my perspective. Of course, um, it doesn't attempt to encompass every possible perspective out there. It does come from my own upbringing and my own existence in this world. But there's a lot of representations of objects, the things that are in my surroundings, but then there's also representations of things, objects, and animals and situations that are on the internet. And of course, the way that media is presented to us and so readily available and all kind of streamlined, sometimes it's hard to tell, well, what the take on that is, if something is being celebrated or critiqued. And that's an idea that I'm really excited about. That something can be both celebrated and critiqued at the same time. So it's
Well,
both objects and found images.
right. Well, and when I say mundane, I don't mean to suggest, I mean, actually the objects don't seem at all mundane in the way you are depicting them. They almost
Right.
seem idealized, like they're in some ways the most beautiful blenders and toasters and but there's also a lot of food. Like when you do a piece of cake, it's kind of makes me salivate, but it's not really like super naturalistic at all. There's a sort of a heightened perspective on it, I guess. Is that the way you would?
Yeah, well, I think when I talk about them, I usually say how the process, I do a lot of masking, use a lot of masking tape, and I cut out shapes with an X-Acto knife and paint areas of color and repeat that process over and over again. So the images are created in a somewhat reductive manner. So when I use an image, either a photograph that I took myself or an image I found online or multiple images that I juxtapose into one scenario, I tend to convert that reference to black and white, reduce the image down to shapes via the values, the relative lightness and darknesses, and then rebuild the image from there. However, it sounds like it sounds like you could come up with a result that's quite abstract, but it's surprising how little visual information our brains need to complete an image of something that is, really recognizable, even if it's like you said, a toaster or a piece of toast or a lamb or an alligator. Based on our lived experience, we can construct these images with fairly small amounts of visual information.
Well, and you spoke about residencies, that you had two residencies later in 2020. I guess they were both sort of the last part of the year.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to the idea of having a residency during the pandemic. Both seems to make sense, but also like raise questions. What was your experience? And I'm assuming you've had residencies pre-pandemic.
Yes.
Is that and you might have residencies lined up for later in the next year or more.
Yeah.
But what was the experience like of like going away and traveling and being somewhere else during the pandemic? Was that kind of freeing? How much impact did that have that might have been beyond the typical impact of a residency, if any?
Yeah, well, it was good to get away, just to go somewhere else. Even though I like Louisville quite a bit, it was nice just to go somewhere for a month or a few months. But both of the residencies I did, one was the Stewart Artist in Residence at South Dakota State University in Brookings, and the other one was at the 701 Center for Contemporary Art in Columbia, South Carolina. And both of those residencies were fairly different than almost all the residencies I've previously done. I've done about a dozen, whereas I was the only resident. So that was very different than a situation where I would have been in a group of artists, a group of other artists or writers, or composers, and so on. So I was fairly isolated, which made sense for the for the pandemic. I had been accepted into a couple other residency programs that were postponed or canceled because they did involve a group of artists, and the facilities were not really prepared to, deal with quarantining individual artists, especially since the point of a lot of residencies program is to bring together a small group of artists for dynamic conversation and critique and art making and eating and whatever else artists do when left to their own devices. So it really was time and space in a different place. Kind of when I go somewhere else outside of my own studio, I love my studio. But there's also just being in a different place, even without trying, or kind of requires me to adjust the way I look at what I'm doing, kind of revisit the context of the work. Especially since last summer, and not all this work, there's some work that I was working on last summer that is not in this coffee show, that was based on my own kitchen. There's one piece from that series that is in the coffee show, but the bulk of that work is not in the coffee show just because it didn't fit with the theme, the kind of the overarching theme. And so it was specific because for a while during the first part of the pandemic, I was taking photos of the dirty dishes in my sink every morning and then going to the studio and making these paintings of the still lifes. And I did that over and over again to where I have probably about 30 or 40 or 50 of those. I can't really remember. So going to another place and, let's say, not having the own dishes that I was familiar with, shifted the way I thought about that body of work, because that body of work was so much about the intimacy with these common mundane objects that we might have, that we develop over time and completely ignore. So that's a long-winded explanation, but I think just being in another place has to shift the way I look at the work. And I did meet a few people too. Met a few artists and curators and had some good conversations that wouldn't have been possible, or probably just wouldn't have happened based on, meeting new people. So they're both good in their own ways.
Now, do you think has the pandemic? I almost hate to ask this question, but it seems meaningful maybe to a lot of artists. Do you think the pandemic itself has affected your work or your approach to these kinds of images?
I mean, I think it can't not. I don't think that we exist in a vacuum. I think that everything around me is always influencing me, whether I'm conscious of it or not, or whether I choose to make it a main topic of the work. It's always there, and it plays a role. We were talking earlier in a different conversation about objectivity, and I said I don't believe in complete objectivity, and I think it's just because every interaction there's some subjectivity in every interaction we have. I don't think you can ever erase your personal experience, lived experience from the world around you. You can't pretend to be completely objective. And if you are, you're just either lying or you just don't know any better. So I think that it's definitely affected the work. Although I'm not sure. I think that I'm still working on a lot of this work. So for me, making the work is generally my way of figuring out what I'm thinking about. It's kind of a way to work through ideas. So I don't usually know exactly what I'm doing until the work is finished and I've moved on to the next body of work. So I think still working on a lot of work that I started over the past year. It's hard for me to pinpoint very specific ways that the pandemic has affected that, but I'm sure it's played a role.
So it may be that you would look back at this time, and in another year or so, you might look back at the work you made during this time and then have some sort of insight into its relationship to living through a pandemic. But
yes, of course.
When I your work, your work is almost, you do some things that are like conventional squares or whatever, but most of what you do, the work is cut out, so it has a curvilinear edge to it, or I guess is the way to say that. So the two-dimensional work starts to be suggestive of a three-dimensional sort of piece in a way. It seems to me like the kind of things you're doing. Are you ever tempted to push into doing more three-dimensional work, or have you in the past?
Some of my work does move into 3 dimensions a little bit. It's still based on the wall. Some pieces in the past, like there was a installation I had at KMAC a couple years ago as part of the triennial, where there
Right.
was a piece that moved onto the floor. A few pieces in the Quappy show do that as well. There is one piece which is, I guess, could be thought about as sculpture in the round. There was a decision to take the piece that I had previously planned on adhering to the wall and move it out into the space. So that's exciting, but also, I guess I tend not to think about I do think about it, of course, because you have to think about these things as an artist, but I don't think that's the most interesting question about the work. Is it painting or is it sculpture? Is it installation, or is it this or is it that? And so I guess I'm happy to hear other insights, but I spend more time thinking about, is the work engaging? What is it saying? Is it interesting? Um, versus thinking so much about the dimensionality and what that means. But of course, that's an important conversation. I do think that the work, it maybe just based on my own education, exists more in the context of painting than it does sculpture. But that
Mhm.
might also be because that's where my education is. And I don't know as much about the history of sculpture as I do painting. So it might just be my limited perspective.
Well, I think it's an interesting sort of a tension that might arise in the viewer about asking questions about, like, well, this is painting, except, well, no, and now it just broke onto another surface. Does that make it? I mean, I think what you're doing now probably just sort of helps to engage the viewer and be a little bit provocative when they're viewing things, because I think a lot of people approach looking at art, they want to see things within their own experience and their own definition of things, right?
Right.
People tend to want to categorize and put labels on things, and um, to say you're a painter, I think, right, immediately people think they're going to walk in and see canvases, and so I think right away your work is forcing people to question their assumptions and their biases about stuff. So
Okay, I like that. I like that. Yeah, and the one piece that I mentioned at Quappy Projects, um, it's called Roadkill and Road Snacks, in case that makes you more likely to go see it. It does basically exist in the round away from the wall. The wall exists as a backdrop, but all of the pieces in it, I still think of as paintings, even though they have dimension. They're all paintings of flat objects. So oftentimes all the time, my paintings are flat representations of 3-dimensional objects. And
mhm.
this one painting, even though the piece itself, I guess, could appear more like sculpture or installation, the paintings are 2-dimensional representations of 2-dimensional objects. Haven't thought through that completely and come to a conclusion on what that means exactly, but it is exciting and interesting and something for me to pursue as I move on, keep making work.
Well, another aspect, I think, and I may be thinking back to when I was first seeing some of your work, that there is a there's a certain sort of clean, sort of slick quality to the images that is also suggestive of, let's say, advertising, right? And I think particularly because so many of these objects, I think we've all seen things in our kitchen. Probably the first time was through some sort of advertising, right? That's how we came to decide to buy that particular item or gizmo. So, is there a relationship between the objects and that sort of history, the way they exist in our culture?
Yeah, definitely. I think advertising is interesting in the ways that it does influence us, also oftentimes in subversive ways. Um, I've always been attracted to kind of mid-century advertising. I have a bunch of ladies' home journals and Better Homes and Gardens from like the 1950s and 1960s. And I noticed at one point that the advertising in those magazines is pretty straightforward for the most part. It's like a picture of a woman with her hand on her head, and it's an advertisement for headache medicine, or it's a giant, you know, 5 times larger than life picture of ground beef, and it's an ad for ground beef. Whereas you fast forward to the late 80s, early 90s, and up until now, that, you know, when I was alive, advertising has become very subversive. And sometimes you don't even know that you're being fed an advertisement. You know, you think of it as entertainment, but it's actually advertisement, or it's social media. Also, the way that we consume affects advertising, and then advertising affects the way we consume. And so it's this endless cycle of um, of, of ads, of capitalism, I guess.
Consumerism. I think
Yeah,
consumerism
consumerism.
is an endless cycle.
Yes, it is.
That pretty much describes consumerism.
Right. I remember there's like a series of a bunch of the cartoons that were popular when I was a kid were developed to sell toys, versus where we think of like action figures come from shows that already exist. It happened in the reverse direction. Which I think that that sort of thing is interesting. Also, apparently there are these videos that are really popular on YouTube for kids where it's a kid and they get a toy and they take it out of its package, and it's this whole thing, and lots of people watch these videos. Therefore, a lot of the toy companies have responded by making the packaging of the toys more complex to kind of draw out the process and bring in more viewers. And so again, it's just this cycle of one responding to the other and back and forth. I think it's really inescapable too.
Fascinating. So when we talk about objectivity and there's no such thing as objectivity, that sort of underscores all of that.
Yeah, well, I just don't think you always know the way that you're being influenced.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't mean that there's no personal responsibility. I am a very strong believer in, you know, you're responsible for what you say and what you put out into the world, but to pretend that you're completely objective about all of your decisions and opinions is problematic.
Well, Lori, that's about all the time we have right now. Thank you for joining me today. I want to remind people, so we're talking to Lori Larusso, who currently lives and works in Louisville, Kentucky. She has a show up right now at Guapi Projects called Rogue Intensities, which is up through June 12th. She was good to point out. So you should go see her show. You should go see, because Guapi Projects is also such a beautiful gallery. But if you enjoyed this conversation, you should be wanting to go to that show, I would think. Hopefully it whetted your appetite. But but thank you again, Lori.
Thanks, Keith.